Good afternoon. Today's lecture is on ancient Athens and the early history of rhetoric. I will discuss some historical context on the development of rhetoric as a field of study and a practical skill in ancient Greece. In the second half of the 5th century BCE, it's over 2,000 years ago, Athens was the original place where the idea of rhetoric as a distinct branch of knowledge was developed. Now, the individuals who made rhetoric a popular concept, the idea of rhetoric as the art of persuasion and as something that you could learn and practice in your own lives, were the sophists. So the sophists were a group of teachers who taught rhetorical skills. They popularized the idea that one could learn how to become a better public speaker, and with new skills, new experience, you could have success in the courtroom, success in politics and social settings, etc. And they were very popular. People went to them and paid for help. Again, paid for help to make arguments. Now, their belief that virtue could be taught offered a meritocratic challenge to the view that the excellence was innate, transmitted by heredity and reinforced by upbringing. Now, this is a very important point. The idea that one could learn how to become a strong public speaker and learn how to win debates had a premise, an implied premise, that one could improve one's standing in life, that one could win an argument, could again win a case in court or a policy debate based on one's own skills, not based on necessarily who they were or what class they were born into, but again based on what they could do in the moment. So there was this very strong sense of meritocracy that accompanied the development and rise of rhetoric as a practical, useful skill. And as Richard Toy reminds us, the sophists deserve to be taken seriously, not least as the advocates of a very modern notion that the art of communication can be taught and that it is a marketable skill. I think that is a remarkable idea, that over 2,000 years ago, the sophists made money teaching others how to communicate better, how to win arguments, and how to be successful in public life. So why did rhetoric catch on so rapidly in Athens? Well, for a start, here was a place just getting used to a radical and unprecedented experiment with democracy. Sam Leith, reflecting on the new political system emerging in Athens, explains that it was only in the early 5th century BC that the popular assembly became the central repository of power in the Athenian state. Now, this assembly, a democratic institution, replaced how politics was done previously. Political states that were ruled by oligarchies or tyrants, and whose political states weren't fertile ground for the growth of public speaking. These tyrants, these kings, they didn't have to persuade anyone through language. Whatever they'd said was rule, was the law. There was no reason, again, to have any skill in public speaking because you weren't trying to persuade anyone anyways. However, with the popular assembly in ancient Athens, now the principle of persuasive speech was at the heart of government. With democracy, politicians have to be able to persuade large group of voters, large group of citizens, to agree with policy proposals, endorse those proposals, and bring them into fruition. No individual king, no individual tyrant can make rules on their own. They need the will of the people. And in order to get the will of the people, you have to be persuasive. In the introduction to his translation of The Art of Rhetoric, H.C. Lawson Tancred elaborates on this historical context. He writes, "In the societies of the early archaic age, the prevalent systems of government were either aristocracies or tyrannies. Neither of these was conducive to the flowering of public debate. There is no great mystery, then, in the fact that it took the rise of democracies and otherwise open societies at Athens and elsewhere to create the climate in which public eloquence became a political indispensability. When power was to be secured either by brute force or by the inheritance of authority from ancestors, there was little need for the politician to find convincing reasons for the citizens to accept his policies. Indeed, to have offered them such reasons might well have been to risk undermining his other credentials by implying their insufficiency. Now, I want to take a little time to think about the actual political structure that emerged during this great experimentation with democracy in ancient Athens. The main thing to note is that most of the politics occurred in the assembly, the General Assembly. Now, basically, the assembly was a democratic institution that was open to all adult male citizens. Now, an adult male citizen was someone who had completed military training and had reached adulthood. Now, this left out many people, since women, medics, and slaves did not possess citizenship. They played no political role in the General Assembly. When statistical allowance is made for women, medics, and slaves, those entitled to attend the assembly only composed some 20 to 25% of the total population. Now, there was a second important part of the political process, and that was the Boule, the Council of 500. Now, essentially, this council was an administrative institution. It didn't have any real power. The main responsibility of the council was to supply the assembly with information, potential research, and to help organize the debate. The 500 members were comprised of 50 men from each of the 10 tribes. Members were at least 30 years old, appointed by lot from the entire citizen body, serving for 1 year. They could be appointed one time, but not for consecutive terms. Ultimately, again, the Boule served the General Assembly. It was the General Assembly, though. It was the individual voters, the individual citizens that made the rules. Now, what did this look like in practice? Near the beginning of an assembly, the Secretary of the People would read aloud the agenda, an agenda that was prepared by the Boule. No matter could be discussed by the assembly without being previously considered by the council and posted publicly 5 days prior to the meeting. The chair then called for a show of hands in order to determine whether the council's proposal would be accepted as it stood or if the people wanted to debate. If the proposal was approved, if enough people said yes and no one wanted to debate it in public, then the assembly would move on to the second or third or fourth item on the agenda. However, if anyone demanded a debate, then they would have one. After a debate was requested, the speaker would then advance to the tribune, place a myrtle wreath on his head, and address the assembly. Discussion was unlimited, except that it was restricted to matters included in the agenda. So you can see how the art of persuasion was very important. You might be speaking in front of 6,000 people, you might be speaking in front of 20,000 people. And you had to persuade enough people to vote yes, to agree with the proposal, or to disagree with the proposal and try to shoot it down. Now remember, people didn't have any experience with political debate. Prior to this, the people who had power weren't voted on by the citizens. They had ultimate authority. They didn't have to persuade anyone of anything. It was during this historical moment in ancient Athens that the concept of rhetoric became popularized. And again, the sophists, that group of teachers, were able to make a living helping others win arguments, helping others succeed at public speaking, and potentially public speaking in the assembly, winning over other voters. Again, could be thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of individuals who would listen to anyone at any given time. The individual who contributed the most to the theory of rhetoric in ancient Athens was Aristotle. Aristotle would spend much of his career theorizing the art of persuasion. In the art of rhetoric, Aristotle defines rhetoric as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. In this quote, we can see the importance that Aristotle places on context. As Richard Toye writes, it was not simply about creating beautiful phrases, but about reading situations and seeing how elements of them could be deployed most effectively in order to win over an audience. Therefore, rhetoric requires an awareness of time and place. Ultimately, there is no such thing as a persuasive argument that will be successful at any place, any time. In order to be persuasive, you have to appeal to a specific audience in a specific place, in a specific moment. Therefore, in order to make a successful argument, you have to first be able to identify who the audience is and figure out what is the best set of appeals that can be used to persuade that audience to think, to do, or to believe something. Reflecting on the significance of Aristotle's theory of rhetoric, Sam Leith writes that Aristotle gave rhetoric a philosophical place in the world. Rather than teach a series of tricks and tips for momentary success in speaking, Aristotle sought to form a coherent view of why those tips and tricks worked. If other rhetoric teachers were driving instructors, Aristotle was a mechanic. He didn't just want to know where the accelerator was. He wanted to understand what went on under the hood. His theory of rhetoric is a theory of human nature. He was the first person really to grasp that the study of rhetoric is the study of humanity itself. For Aristotle, the study of rhetoric was the study of humans, how we communicate with each other, how we interact with each other, and how we form a society together. To ask what persuades humans is to ask what makes us tick. What do we value? What are we afraid of? What do we desire? While it is easy to take for granted the role of rhetoric in our daily lives, H.C. Lawson Tancred stresses that this truly was a transformational idea in ancient Athens. He writes, "The notion of philosophical rhetoric, or of a philosophy of rhetoric, may not strike us as extraordinary, but it must have seemed strange to men of the 4th century. For making the subject safe for philosophy, Aristotle was obliged to treat it in a manner that for the first time thoroughly investigated its underpinnings in the other areas of human life." Aristotle sought to grasp the very roots of persuasion itself, which required him to ponder the nature of character and emotion. This approach to rhetoric involved the philosopher in 3 major topics. 1, the detailed psychology of emotions. 2, the use of informal reasoning. And 3, the aesthetics of prose style. Another major contribution by Aristotle is the understanding of 3 rhetorical appeals: ethos, pathos, and logos. Aristotle argued that of all the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are 3 kinds. The first kind depends on the personal character of the speaker, the second on putting the audience into a certain frame of mind, and the third on the proof or apparent proof provided by the words of the speech itself. Now, these 3 appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos, will be the focus of many of our discussions and lectures to come. And in your next major assignment, the rhetorical analysis, you would demonstrate a mastery of all 3 rhetorical appeals: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos. Ethos has to do with who you are and how you come across. Aristotle would include both the way in which you speak and your individual character or integrity in this category. As he wrote, "We believe good men more fully and more readily than others." An example of an ethical appeal: I've served at this university for 28 years. An appeal from the speaker's experience. Pathos. Pathos involves stirring up people's emotions. It includes appeals to people's pity, anger, fear, hope, and the like. An example of an emotional appeal: for-profit colleges are destroying higher education. As stated here, an appeal to the listener's fears and values. Logos. Logos is the use of argumentation. This category includes arguments, data, statistics, and all type of reasoning. An example of a logical appeal: research data demonstrates that students who have attended for-profit colleges have a much higher debt load than students at private or public colleges. Now, this was just a brief overview of the history of rhetoric in ancient Athens, but hopefully it gives you a good introduction into how rhetoric developed alongside democracy and what some of the principles of rhetoric are. In our unit on rhetorical theory, we will explore many of the principles introduced in this lecture, and we will discuss at length many of the contributions that Aristotle made to the theory of rhetoric.